The Duke of Ashford was supposed to arrive on Friday. It was only Tuesday evening when his carriage crested the last ridge of the Cumbrian hills, and the grey stone towers of Harrowden Manor came into view below. 3 days ahead of schedule. The autumn winds had been kind this year, pushing his ship across the channel a full day early, and the roads from Dover had been dry enough to make excellent time. Edward leaned forward in his seat and watched the manor grow larger through the carriage window. Smoke drifted from only 2 chimneys. Strange. At this hour, the kitchens should have been burning through their evening coal, the drawing-room fire blazing, the upper halls warmed for the night. He had a staff of 14 who lived on the grounds year-round, and even in his absence, the house was expected to run as though he might walk through the door at any moment. Which, as it happened, he was about to do.
"Take us round to the east courtyard," Edward called up to his driver, "and keep the lanterns low."
He could not explain the instinct. Something about the quietness of the place, the missing chimney smoke, the way the grounds looked a shade too still for a household at supper. It sat wrong in his chest, like a stone he could not swallow. The carriage rolled through the iron gate without the usual greeting from the groundskeeper. No one came out to take the horses. Edward stepped down onto the gravel and stood there for a moment, listening. Wind through the beech trees, an owl somewhere in the upper wood, and beneath all of it, a silence that had no business being in a house with 14 souls inside. He tried the east door, unlocked. The corridor beyond was dark, and the air smelled of cold ash and candle wax that had burned down hours ago. Edward pulled off his riding gloves and moved through the passageway toward the main hall. His boots echoed against the flagstones. Every door he passed was shut. Every room was black.
"Mrs. Pemberton,"
he called out. His housekeeper's name bounced off the walls and came back to him empty. He reached his study at the far end of the west wing and pushed the heavy oak door open. The room was lit by a single candle on the writing desk, its flame guttering in the draught from the door. And in front of that desk, bound to one of his oak chairs with thick rope, gagged with a strip of torn linen, was Sarah. Edward's blood turned to ice. She was his housemaid, 26 years old, dark-haired, composed in a way that had always struck him as unusual for someone in service. She had come to the estate 2 years ago with a letter of reference from a respectable household in Bath, and she had been so quietly efficient that Edward had barely thought about her beyond signing her quarterly wages. Now she was tied to his chair with her wrists bound behind her back and a cloth stuffed between her teeth, and her dark eyes were wide and locked on his, with an expression that was equal parts relief and warning. Edward crossed the room in 3 strides. He pulled the gag from her mouth first, then crouched behind the chair and began working at the knots. "Who did this to you?" he demanded. "Where is the rest of the staff?" Sarah took 2 steadying breaths. Even now, with rope marks on her wrists and her hair falling loose from its pins, she did not cry or stammer. She spoke in a low, controlled voice, as though she were reporting the weather. "Mrs. Pemberton sent the staff to the village hall for the harvest assembly. I stayed behind to tend the fires and lock up for the night. 3 men came through the balcony doors roughly an hour ago. They wore cloth masks and carried no weapons I could see, though one had a pry bar." The last knot came free. Sarah stood and rubbed the circulation back into her hands, rolling her wrists with a practiced calm that struck Edward as odd. A housemaid who had just been tied up and gagged by intruders should have been shaking. She was steady as a surgeon. "They were searching for something," she continued. "A locked iron box. They turned your desk drawers inside out, pulled books from the shelves, checked behind every painting. When they could not find it, they questioned me." Edward looked around the study. She was right. Every drawer had been yanked open. Papers littered the floor. The painting of his grandfather had been pulled from its hook and leaned against the wall with its backing torn away. "I have no locked iron box," Edward said. "I keep my valuables in the bank vault in Carlisle." Sarah met his gaze. Something shifted behind her eyes, a decision being made in the space of a single heartbeat.
"They were not looking for your iron box, Your Grace," she said quietly. "They were looking for mine." The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. Edward stared at her. "Yours?" "I owe you an explanation, and I intend to give you one fully and honestly, but I must ask that we move from this room first. Those men will be back, and they will bring more. The balcony doors are still broken, and this wing of the house cannot be secured from inside." Edward had commanded men. He had managed estates, negotiated trade contracts, and navigated the treacherous waters of London society. He knew when someone was lying, and he knew when someone was telling the truth while leaving enormous pieces out. Sarah was doing the second. "The wine cellar," he said. "Stone walls, one entrance, iron door with a bolt on the inside." Sarah gave a short nod. "That will do." Edward locked the study door behind them, then led the way down the narrow servants' staircase toward the cellars below. Sarah walked behind him with a sureness of step that told him she knew this route as well as he did, possibly better. He had spent perhaps 3 months total at Harrowden in the past 2 years. She had spent every day. As they descended the last set of stone steps into the cool, vaulted cellar, Edward bolted the heavy iron door and turned to face her. "Now," he said, "tell me who you really are." Sarah straightened her back. The candlelight from the wall sconce threw sharp shadows across her face, and for the first time since he had known her, she did not look like a housemaid. She looked like someone who had been waiting 2 years for this exact conversation. "My name is Sarah Ashworth," she said. "Before I came into your service, I spent 7 years as a field agent for the Whitmore recovery firm in London. We were contracted by banks, insurers, and private estates to recover stolen property and bring evidence against criminal networks." Edward felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His quiet, efficient housemaid, the woman who pressed his linens and polished his silver and kept the upper rooms spotless, was a former agent, and someone very dangerous wanted what she had hidden inside his house. The wine cellar smelled of damp stone and old oak. Rows of bottles lined the walls in iron racks, and a second chamber beyond the archway held the reserved vintages Edward's father had collected 30 years ago. The single wall sconce threw a circle of warm light that barely reached the far corners. Sarah stood with her hands clasped in front of her, straight-backed, the posture of someone accustomed to delivering reports. Edward leaned against a barrel and folded his arms. "The Whitmore Recovery Firm," he repeated. "I have heard the name. They handled the Carstairs forgery affair in '78, if I recall." "You recall correctly. I was part of that operation. I was 20 years old." Edward studied her face. The composure he had always noticed in her, the way she moved through the manor with a quiet awareness of every room and every corridor, the way she positioned herself near doorways rather than in the center of a space, all of it rearranged itself in his mind. Every small detail that had seemed merely peculiar now made perfect sense. "Tell me about Vance," he said. Sarah's expression hardened at the name. "Roland Vance, a master counterfeiter. For nearly a decade he ran the most sophisticated forgery ring in the south of England. Banknotes, shipping bonds, letters of credit. His work was so precise that even experienced bank clerks could not distinguish his prints from genuine currency. He had wealthy patrons across London and Bristol who funded his operations in exchange for a share of the forged notes. And you brought him down." The Whitmore firm was hired by a consortium of 3 banks who had lost a combined fortune to his counterfeits. It took me 14 months to infiltrate his network. I posed as a clerk's widow looking for work and gained the trust of one of his middle agents. Through that connection, I found his workshop in a cellar beneath a chandler's shop on the Bristol docks. She paused. The candlelight caught the edges of her jaw, and Edward could see the tension in it. When the magistrate's men raided the workshop, I personally secured the one piece of evidence Vance feared above everything else, his encrypted ledger. Every transaction he had ever conducted was recorded in that book. Every patron who had funded him, every distributor who had passed his notes into circulation,
every bribe he had paid to keep the authorities from looking too closely. If that ledger were ever fully deciphered and presented to a court, it would bring down some of the most respected names in English society. Edward's jaw tightened. How respected? Titled families, merchant houses, at least 2 members of the aristocracy whose fortunes were built partly on laundered forgeries. The weight of what she was describing settled over the cellar like fog. Edward understood now why Vance would send men to tear apart a remote estate in Cumbria. That ledger was a weapon, and whoever held it held the power to destroy lives.
Vance was sentenced to 12 years in Pentonville, Sarah continued. I left the Whitmore firm shortly after the trial. The work had taken a great deal from me, and certain associates of Vance had begun making inquiries about the agent who had gathered the evidence. My employer arranged for me to disappear. New surname, new references, a position far from London in a quiet household where nobody would think to look. My household, Edward said. Your household. The posting was ideal, remote, well-staffed, and your frequent travels meant fewer questions. I buried the ledger and settled into the work. For 2 years, I believed the matter was finished. And then Vance escaped. Sarah gave a single nod. 6 weeks ago, I received word through an old contact that he had gotten out during a transfer between facilities. By the time the prison authorities raised the alarm, he had vanished entirely. I considered running, but leaving your service abruptly would have drawn attention, and I had nowhere safer to go, so I stayed and hoped he would not find me. He found you. Someone in the old network must have talked. Vance has always had a long reach, even from behind bars. His people arrived tonight, which tells me he knows exactly where I am and what I have. Edward was quiet for a long moment. The candle flame danced against the stone walls. Somewhere above them, the manor sat dark and exposed, its balcony doors broken and its corridors empty. "Where is the ledger now?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. It was the first time he had seen her pause since she began speaking, and it told him the answer carried weight. "I need to show you something." She moved to the far wall of the cellar, past the last rack of bottles, to a section of stonework that looked identical to every other section. She pressed her palm against a block at shoulder height and pushed. The block shifted inward with a grinding sound, and a section of the wall swung open on concealed iron hinges, revealing a narrow chamber beyond. Edward stared. He had owned this estate for 9 years. His father had owned it for 30 before that. Neither of them had known this room existed. "Your manor was built on the foundations of a 16th century fortified house," Sarah said, stepping through the opening. "This vault was part of the original structure. I found it during my first month of service when I was mapping the lower levels." "Mapping the lower levels," Edward repeated flatly, "as one does when polishing silver." The ghost of a smile crossed Sarah's face. It vanished quickly. The hidden vault was small, no larger than a wardrobe. A single shelf held a wooden case, and inside the case, wrapped in oilcloth, sat a leather-bound book roughly the size of a prayer volume. Its pages were dense with columns of numbers and letters arranged in patterns that made no immediate sense, substitution ciphers, transposition grids, and reference codes that would take a skilled cryptographer days to unravel. "This is everything Vance wants," Sarah said, "and everything he is afraid of. Every name, every amount, every drop point, all of it written in his own hand." Edward lifted the ledger carefully, turning it in the light. The leather was worn at the spine, and the pages had the yellowed look of something that had been handled many times before it was hidden away. "We cannot stay here," he said. "If his men return with reinforcements, 14 staff members and a bolted cellar door will buy us hours at best." "I agree. I have been thinking the same since you cut me loose." Edward set the ledger down and looked at her directly. "Then we leave tonight. I have a fast carriage and fresh horses. There is a market town at the foot of the valley where we can change teams and send word to the magistrate." Sarah held his gaze. "You understand that by helping me, you place yourself in direct conflict with Vance and everyone connected to him. This is my burden, Your Grace. You have no obligation to carry it." Edward straightened and tugged the front of his coat.
You are a member of my household, Miss Ashworth. Your burdens became mine the day I signed your contract of employment, and I do not abandon my people to criminals, regardless of how inconvenient the timing. He picked up the ledger and tucked it inside his coat. Pack what you can carry in 5 minutes. We ride within the quarter hour. The courtyard was black as pitch when they stepped outside. A thin sliver of moon hung behind the clouds, offering just enough light to see the outline of the stables across the gravel yard. The wind had picked up since Edward's arrival, carrying the sharp scent of pine and wet earth down from the higher slopes. Edward moved quickly to the stable block and roused the 2 carriage horses from their stalls. They were not his fastest pair. Those were still being rested at the coaching house in Kendal, but they were strong, mountain-bred animals who knew the roads well enough to manage them half-blind. Sarah appeared beside him, carrying a leather satchel over one shoulder. She had changed out of her housemaid's dress in under 3 minutes and now wore a dark woolen traveling cloak over a plain cotton blouse and sturdy skirt. Practical clothing, the kind of outfit someone chose when they expected to move fast and did not care about appearances. "Can you handle a team?" Edward asked, buckling the harness on the second horse. "I can handle a team, a single mount, and a narrowboat tiller if it comes to that." Edward decided to stop being surprised by the things Sarah could do. They hitched the pair to a light 2-seat carriage, faster than the heavy coach Edward had arrived in, and rolled out through the east gate with the lanterns unlit. Sarah sat beside him on the driver's bench, watching the tree line on both sides of the gravel drive as the estate fell away behind them. "There is a ridge road that runs along the top of the valley," Edward said, keeping his voice low. "It meets the main turnpike 4 miles south. If Vance's men are watching the house, they will expect us to take the valley floor where the road is wider. Then the ridge is the better choice." Edward turned the horses onto a narrow track that climbed steeply through a stand of birch trees. The carriage jolted over roots and loose stone, and the wheels found the packed earth of the ridge path after a quarter-mile of rough climbing. From up here, the valley opened below them in shades of gray and black, the river at the bottom catching what little moonlight slipped through the clouds. They drove in silence for the first mile. Edward kept the horses at a steady trot, fast enough to cover ground, but controlled enough to manage the uneven surface. The ridge path was not built for carriages. It was a shepherd's track, wide enough for a single cart, with a steep drop on the left side that fell away into darkness. Sarah broke the quiet first. "There will be scouts on the main road. Vance always posts watchers at crossings and bridge points. If we are seen heading south, he will know we are making for the market town." "Which is precisely why I want to be seen." Sarah turned to look at him. "You want them to follow us?" "I want them to follow this carriage. The market town has a telegraph office and a magistrate's post. Vance's men will assume we are heading there to raise the alarm and send word to London. They will commit their numbers to intercepting us on the south road. While the real message goes a different way." Edward allowed himself a thin smile. "I sent my valet ahead to Kendal 3 days ago to prepare my lodgings there. He will not have heard about tonight's events. Before we left, I wrote a letter and placed it in the groundskeeper's cottage with instructions to ride north at first light and deliver it to him. My valet will carry it to the Kendal magistrate by tomorrow afternoon." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the layers. "So the pursuit goes south with us, the alarm goes north through your valet, and Vance's men find themselves squeezed between 2 responses." "That is the shape of it." "You have a talent for this, Your Grace." "I have a talent for managing difficult tenants and uncooperative livestock. Fugitive counterfeiters are merely the next step along the same path." The ridge road curved around the shoulder of the hill, and the trees thinned out to open moorland. The wind hit them full in the face here, cold and sharp with the taste of rain coming. Edward pulled his collar up and urged the horses forward. Below and to the east, he could just make out the faint glow of lanterns moving along the valley floor road. 2, perhaps 3 lights bobbing in the darkness, heading toward the manor. "There," Sarah said, pointing down. "They are coming back. More of them this time." Edward counted the lights. 4, possibly 5. a larger party than the three who had broken in earlier. Vance was escalating quickly.
"How many men does he command?" Edward asked. "In his prime, he had a network of over 30 agents spread across 4 counties. After his arrest, most scattered. I would estimate he has reassembled perhaps 10 or 12, enough to search a house and watch the roads, not enough to hold territory against a determined response." "Then our task is to be that determined response before he gathers more."
The ridge road began its descent toward the southern turnpike. The surface improved as they dropped in elevation, the packed earth giving way to gravel and then to the hard tamped surface of a proper coaching road. Edward brought the horses up to a canter. The carriage rattled and swayed, but the suspension held, and the horses found their rhythm on the better ground. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon, they had covered nearly 12 miles. The market town of Thornfield appeared below them in the valley, its church spire and cluster of stone buildings emerging from the morning mist like a painting half-finished. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the coaching inn at the edge of town, and Edward could hear the distant clatter of the early mail coach being prepared in the yard. "We change horses at the inn," Edward said, "and we keep our eyes open. If Vance has informants on the mail routes, this is where they will be." Sarah reached beneath her cloak and adjusted something at her waist. Edward chose not to ask what it was.
"Stay close to me inside," she said, "and let me do the watching."
The Valley Post House was a broad, 2-story building of dark limestone with a slate roof and a yard large enough to turn a 4-horse mail coach without scraping the walls. At 7:30 in the morning, the place was already alive with activity. Ostlers led teams of horses between the stables and the hitching posts. A mail guard in his red coat sat on the bench of the morning coach, checking his timepiece. Travelers moved in and out of the front door, carrying cases and parcels, and the smell of fried bacon and strong tea drifted from the kitchen windows. Edward pulled their carriage into the far corner of the yard, away from the main traffic. He climbed down and stretched the stiffness from his legs while Sarah scanned the yard with the quiet attention of someone cataloging every face and every exit.
"I will arrange fresh horses," Edward said. "My name carries enough weight at coaching houses along this route. We should be able to exchange within the half-hour." "Before you go inside, look at the man sitting on the bench beside the water trough. Gray coat, brown hat, reading a newspaper."
Edward glanced across the yard. The man Sarah described was sitting with his legs crossed and the morning edition of the Cumberland Gazette open in front of him. He appeared entirely unremarkable. A commercial traveler waiting for his coach, perhaps, or a local businessman killing time before an appointment. What about him?
"He has been reading the same page for the past 4 minutes. He has not turned it once. And every time a coach arrives or a rider enters the yard, his eyes move to the gate before going back to the paper."
Edward looked again. The man's posture was relaxed, his clothing ordinary, his face partially hidden by the brim of his hat. He could have been anyone. That, Edward was beginning to understand, was exactly the point. Vance's man. An informant on the mail routes, Vance used them extensively during his forgery operations. They sit at coaching inns and post houses, watching who comes and goes, noting which parcels are sent and where. This one is waiting for something specific. Edward thought for a moment. The morning mail coach departs at 8 o'clock. If he is watching the mail, he is expecting a letter. Or sending one. They entered the inn through the side door, avoiding the main hall where the breakfast crowd gathered around long tables. Edward used his title to secure a private parlor on the upper floor, a small, wood-paneled room with a window overlooking the yard. The innkeeper, a stout man named Haskell, who had served Edward's family for years, brought tea and cold ham without asking questions. From the window they had a clear view of the bench where the man in the grey coat continued his performance with the newspaper. "We need to know what he is waiting for," Sarah said, standing at the edge of the curtain where she could watch without being seen. "If Vance is communicating with his people through the mail network, any letter passing through this inn could tell us where he is operating from. Can you get close enough to find out?" Sarah set down her teacup. I spent 3 years intercepting correspondence for the Whitmore firm. Give me 10 minutes and a reason to be near the mail desk." She removed her traveling cloak and let her hair down from its pins, shaking it loose around her shoulders. From her satchel, she produced a lace-trimmed bonnet and a pair of simple cotton gloves. The transformation was small, but effective. The composed, sharp-eyed woman who had been reading the yard like a battlefield now looked like a country gentlewoman waiting to post a letter to her sister. "I will need something to send," she said. Edward pulled a blank sheet of paper from the writing desk in the corner, scrawled a meaningless note about the weather and the condition of the roads, folded it, and addressed it to his solicitor in Carlisle. Sarah took the letter and left the room. From the window, Edward watched her cross the yard at an unhurried pace, pausing to adjust her bonnet near the stable doors before continuing to the front entrance. She moved with a casual ease that made it impossible to believe she was doing anything other than running an ordinary errand. She disappeared inside. 5 minutes passed. The man on the bench folded his newspaper and stood, walking toward the front door of the inn. Edward's pulse quickened, but he held his position at the window and waited. 7 minutes later, Sarah returned to the private parlor. She closed the door behind her and set a folded letter on the table. It was sealed with dark red wax, pressed with a plain stamp. No family crest, no initials. "The mail clerk keeps outgoing letters in an open tray behind the counter until the coach guard collects them at departure. This was sitting on top. It is addressed to a shipping office in Whitehaven." "How did you take it without being noticed?" "I posted your letter and asked the clerk about the schedule to Carlisle. While he checked his timetable, I lifted this from the tray and replaced it with a blank envelope of the same size and color. He will not notice until the coach guard sorts the bag, and by then we will be gone." Edward picked up the letter and examined the seal. "Shall we?" He broke the wax and unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was cramped and hasty, written in plain English with no attempt at cipher. Whoever had composed it was in a hurry and confident the letter would reach its recipient without interception. Sarah read over his shoulder. The color drained from her face as she reached the final lines. "It is a report," she said quietly. "The man in the gray coat has been watching this route for 3 days, logging every carriage and rider heading south from the Cumbrian hills. And this letter is addressed to Vance directly, care of a warehouse on the Whitehaven harbor front." Edward folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat beside the ledger. "Then we know where he is." "We know where he was yesterday. A man like Vance does not stay in one place for long." "Then we had better move quickly." Edward reached for his hat. "I have a family property in the lowlands, 2 hours south of here. It has been closed for the season, but the caretaker keeps it in order. We can examine the ledger properly there, away from the roads and the coaching routes." Sarah gathered her cloak and satchel. At the door, she paused. "Your Grace, you should understand something. The moment we opened that letter, we crossed a line. Vance will know someone intercepted his communication. He will assume it was me, and he will assume I now know where to find him." "Good," Edward said. "I would rather he spend his energy worrying about what we know than planning his next move against us." They left the inn through the kitchen yard, settled their account for the fresh horses, and were back on the road before the 8 o'clock mail coach had even departed the yard. The lowland townhouse stood at the end of a quiet lane in the village of Brampton, half hidden behind a high stone wall and a row of ancient yew trees. It was a handsome Georgian building of red brick with tall sash windows and a portico supported by 2 slender columns, the kind of property that announced old money without shouting about it. Edward's family had owned the house for 3 generations. His grandmother had used it as her autumn residence, and his father had kept it as a stopover point between the mountain estate and London. Since inheriting the property, Edward had visited perhaps twice a year, leaving its care to an elderly caretaker named Mr. Finch, who lived in a cottage at the rear of the grounds. Mr. Finch met them at the gate with a lantern and a look of mild bewilderment. Edward offered a brief explanation about unexpected travel and the need for a night's lodging. The old man asked no further questions, opened the house, lit the fires in the library and the upstairs bedchambers, and retired to his cottage with the quiet discretion of a servant who had learned decades ago that the affairs of the gentry were best left unexamined. The library was a long, narrow room, lined floor to ceiling with books that had not been moved from their shelves in years. A fine layer of dust covered the reading table, and the air carried the dry, papery smell of leather bindings and old ink. 2 armchairs flanked the fireplace, and a tall mahogany mantel clock stood against the far wall between the windows, its pendulum still and its face showing 3:30 from some forgotten afternoon. Sarah walked directly to the clock. "This is where you hid it," Edward said, watching her. "The Whitmore firm trained us to choose hiding places that would survive a thorough search. Loose floorboards and hollow walls are the first places anyone checks. Functional objects, clocks, furniture with mechanical parts, instrument cases, are overlooked because searchers assume they contain only their intended mechanisms." She opened the clock's front panel and reached inside, past the pendulum and the weight chains, to a narrow cavity behind the movement. From it, she withdrew a flat wooden case, no larger than a cigar box, wrapped in a square of waxed canvas. "I placed this here during my 2nd week of service," she said. "Your caretaker showed me through the house when I accompanied the housekeeper on a linen inventory. I memorized the layout and returned alone 2 days later." Edward raised an eyebrow. "You traveled 40 miles from my estate to hide a box inside a clock?" 43 miles, and the distance was the point. If Vance's people ever searched the mountain estate, they would find nothing. The ledger would be in a separate property, under a different lock, with no obvious connection to me. She set the case on the reading table and unwrapped the canvas. Inside, cushioned in a bed of cotton wadding, lay the encrypted ledger Edward had already seen in the wine cellar vault. But beside it lay a second item he had not seen before. A thin sheaf of loose papers, folded twice and tied with a length of butcher's twine. "You said the ledger was in the wine cellar," Edward said carefully. "The ledger was in the wine cellar. These are the cipher keys. Without them, the ledger is a book of meaningless numbers. I kept them separately for exactly this reason. If either piece was found alone, it would be useless." Edward sat down heavily in one of the armchairs. The level of planning, the years of preparation, the deliberate separation of evidence across multiple locations. This woman had been living inside his household like a coiled spring, ready for a moment she had hoped would never arrive. Sarah spread the cipher keys across the table and opened the ledger beside them. She worked with a focus that shut out everything else in the room: the fire, the dust, the sound of rain beginning to tap against the windows. Her fingers moved across the columns of numbers and letters, cross-referencing each entry against the key sheets, murmuring occasional fragments to herself as patterns emerged from the code. Edward watched without interrupting. He understood enough about ciphers from his time managing military supply contracts to recognize the structure: a polyalphabetic substitution system, where each letter was shifted according to a rotating keyword. Sophisticated for a criminal enterprise, and further proof that Vance was no ordinary forger. After nearly an hour, Sarah sat back in her chair. Her face had changed. The steady composure she had maintained since the moment Edward cut her free had cracked, and something close to shock had taken its place. "What is it?" Edward asked. "I was wrong about this ledger. I have been wrong for 4 years. She turned the book toward him and pointed to a section near the back, a dense block of entries she had decoded onto a separate sheet of paper. Edward leaned forward and read her neat, cramped handwriting. "These are not just names and transactions," Sarah said. "The last 40 pages of this ledger contain a detailed inventory, locations, quantities, and access instructions for a collection of forged banknotes that were never put into circulation. Vance manufactured them in the final months before his arrest, but the raid happened before he could distribute them." "How much are we talking about?" Sarah's voice was flat. "By my count, the equivalent of £90,000 in counterfeit £5 notes, hidden across 3 locations in the north of England." The number hung in the air between them. £90,000. A sum large enough to buy a dozen country estates, fund a private army, or destabilize the currency of an entire region if the notes entered circulation.
That is why he escaped, Edward said slowly. He did not break out of Pentonville to settle old scores or recover evidence against his patrons. He broke out because there is a fortune in forged currency sitting in hiding, and this ledger is the only map to it. Sarah nodded. And now we hold that map. Edward stood and moved to the window. The rain was falling steadily now, blurring the view of the lane and the yew trees beyond. Somewhere out there, Vance was moving toward Whitehaven with a gang of reassembled criminals and the single-minded desperation of a man who had already lost everything once and would do anything to avoid losing it again. "We cannot simply hand this to the magistrate and walk away," Edward said. "If those notes reach circulation before the authorities locate them, the damage will be catastrophic. Banks will fail. Families will lose their savings." "I know," Sarah said, "which is why we need to find Vance before he finds another way to the stash. And thanks to that letter from the coaching inn, we know exactly where to start looking." Edward turned from the window. Whitehaven Harbor. Whitehaven Harbor. Whitehaven was a town built on trade and salt air. Its harbor curved in a broad crescent along the Irish Sea coast, sheltered by two long stone piers that reached out into the gray water like arms holding the ships in place. Warehouses lined the quayside in a solid row of dark brick and timber, their loading doors facing the water, their rear entrances opening onto narrow, cobbled lanes, where carts and porters moved goods between the docks and the town. Edward and Sarah arrived on the morning of the fourth day, having travelled through the night from Brampton on fresh horses hired from a farmstead south of Cockermouth. They left the carriage at a livery stable on the edge of town and walked the last half-mile on foot, dressed to draw as little attention as possible. Edward wore a plain wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. Sarah had pinned her hair beneath a cotton cap and carried a market basket over her arm, looking for all the world like a tradesman's wife on her way to buy fish. The harbor was busy despite the overcast sky. A coal brig was unloading at the far pier, its crew passing baskets hand over hand in a long chain from the hold to the quay. Two coastal schooners sat at anchor in the middle of the harbor, their rigging slack and their decks empty. Fishing boats clustered near the inner wall, and the smell of tar, brine, and smoked herring hung over everything like a damp blanket. "The letter mentioned a warehouse," Sarah said, keeping her voice low as they walked along the quayside. "A shipping office on the harbor front. Vance would choose somewhere with multiple exits and easy access to a vessel in case he needed to leave quickly." Edward studied the row of warehouses. Most bore painted signs advertising their owners: coal merchants, grain importers, a rope and sail maker, a customs broker. One building near the southern end of the quay had no sign at all. Its loading doors were shut, its windows dark, and a heavy iron chain secured the front entrance. It looked abandoned, which, in Edward's experience, meant it was anything but. "There," Sarah said, following his gaze. "That is exactly the kind of building he would use." They found a tea house on the opposite side of the quay, with a window seat that offered a clear view of the unmarked warehouse. Edward ordered a pot of Darjeeling and 2 scones, and they settled in to watch. Within 20 minutes, Sarah's instinct proved correct. A man in a docker's cap approached the warehouse from the lane behind it, knocked twice on a side door, and was admitted by someone inside. 10 minutes later, a second man arrived, carrying a canvas bag over his shoulder, and entered through the same door. "At least 2 inside, probably more," Sarah said. "Vance will have a lookout posted somewhere with a view of the harbor approach. We need to assume we have already been seen." "Then let us give them something worth seeing." Edward laid out his plan over the cooling tea. It was simple, which he had learned from years of estate management was the only kind of plan that survived contact with reality. He would approach the warehouse openly, presenting himself as a wealthy aristocrat interested in purchasing a vessel for private use.
His title and bearing would get him through the door.
Once inside, he would engage whoever was managing the premises in conversation, taking careful note of the interior layout, the number of men present, and any indication of where Vance himself might be. Meanwhile, Sarah would position herself at the rear of the building, watching the back exit. When Edward's visit flushed the occupants into activity, as it inevitably would, since a duke asking questions at a criminal hideout would cause immediate alarm, she would follow whoever left and track them to Vance's actual location.
"The warehouse is a relay point," Sarah explained. "Vance would never operate from such an obvious position on the harbor front. He will have a second location nearby, somewhere more defensible, where he coordinates his movements. The men inside that warehouse are messengers. If we spook them, they will run straight to him." "And the ledger?" Sarah reached into her satchel and produced a leather-bound book, roughly the same size and shape as Vance's encrypted ledger. She had purchased it from a stationer's shop in Brampton the previous afternoon and spent an hour filling its pages with convincing nonsense. Columns of random numbers and letters, arranged in patterns that mimicked the real cipher at a glance.
"If they search me, they will find nothing," Edward said. "But if they search the carriage at the livery stable, they will find this tucked beneath the seat. A man fleeing with stolen evidence would hide it in exactly such a place."
"You want them to find it?" "I want them to believe they have found it. The moment Vance thinks he has recovered his ledger, he will stop searching and focus on reaching his hidden stash. That pause is our opportunity." Sarah considered this for a long moment, turning her teacup slowly on its saucer. "It could work, but you will be walking into a room full of Vance's men, alone, with nothing to protect you except your name and your nerve." "My name has opened every door in Cumberland for 3 generations, and my nerve has survived London society, which I assure you is considerably more terrifying than a warehouse full of counterfeiters." Sarah did not smile, but something in her expression softened briefly.
They finished their tea and parted ways at the corner of the quay. Sarah moved south along the harbor wall, disappearing into the crowd of dock workers and fishwives with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning how to become invisible. Edward straightened his coat, adjusted his hat to a more aristocratic angle, and walked directly toward the unmarked warehouse. He knocked on the side door with the confidence of a man who owned half the county and expected the other half to answer when he called. The door opened. A thick-necked man with a docker's cap and suspicious eyes looked him up and down. "Good morning," Edward said pleasantly. "I understand this premises may be available for lease. I am looking for warehouse space to store equipment for a private vessel I am considering purchasing. Whom might I speak with regarding terms?" The man hesitated. Edward held his gaze with the calm, expectant patience of a duke who was accustomed to waiting for doors to open, because they always did. After a long moment, the man stepped aside and let him in. Edward spent exactly 14 minutes inside the warehouse. He counted every one of them by the pocket watch he kept in his waistcoat, checking it twice with the casual impatience of a man whose time was worth more than whatever he was being shown. The interior confirmed Sarah's suspicions. The ground floor was mostly empty, a few crates stacked against the walls, a table with the remains of a meal, 3 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove giving off a thin trail of smoke. 2 men sat at the table, playing cards. The thick-necked doorman made 3. A 4th stood near the rear entrance with his arms folded, watching Edward with undisguised hostility. None of them was Vance. Edward played his role with the ease of a man born to command attention. He asked about ceiling heights, loading access, proximity to the customs house, and whether the building had suffered water damage during the winter storms. The men answered in short, guarded sentences, clearly uncomfortable with his presence and unsure how to handle a titled visitor who showed no sign of leaving until his questions were answered. When he finally departed through the front door, thanking them for their time and promising to send his solicitor with a formal enquiry, he could feel the tension behind him like heat from a furnace. He crossed the quay at a measured pace, resisting every instinct that told him to look back. He reached the tea house and took a seat by the window.
Within 3 minutes, the rear door of the warehouse opened, and 2 men emerged at a hurried walk, heading south along the harbor lane. They moved with the stiff urgency of men carrying a message they had been told to deliver immediately. Sarah would be behind them.
Edward could not see her, but he did not need to. If she had survived 7 years tracking criminals through the back streets of London and Bristol, she could manage a pair of nervous couriers along a harbour front in broad daylight. He waited. The church clock on the hill above the town struck noon. The coal brig finished unloading and began taking on ballast. A fishmonger set up his stall at the corner of the quay and started calling out prices for the morning catch. The ordinary business of a working harbour carried on around Edward, while he sat perfectly still and watched the lane where the 2 men had disappeared. 40 minutes later, Sarah slipped into the chair opposite him. Her face was flushed from walking, and her cotton cap had been replaced with a shawl she must have acquired along the way. Another small transformation, another layer of invisibility. "I found him," she said.
Where?
"There is an old watchtower on the coastal cliffs about 2 miles south of town, stone-built, medieval, overlooking a small cove with a shingle beach. The 2 men from the warehouse walked the harbour road until it became a footpath along the cliff edge, then descended to the tower through a gate in the perimeter wall. I watched from the ridge above. How many men? I counted 6 entering or moving within the grounds during the time I observed. There may be more inside the tower itself. The structure has a walled courtyard, a main tower of 3 or 4 stories, and what appears to be a gatehouse at the entrance. Defenses? The courtyard has heavy iron gates, old but solid. The walls are 8 feet high with no handholds. The only other access I could see was a footpath leading down from the cliffs to the cove below, which suggests there may be a lower entrance or tunnel connecting the tower to the beach. Edward absorbed this in silence. A fortified medieval watchtower with iron gates, stone walls, and a possible escape route to the sea. Vance had chosen his position well. A direct approach would be impossible without a company of soldiers, and by the time Edward could summon that kind of force from the nearest garrison, Vance would be gone. "We need to be clever about this," he said. "I have been thinking about that on the walk back." Sarah leaned forward, keeping her voice beneath the noise of the tea house. "The tower's strength is also its weakness. Those iron gates and stone walls keep people out, but they also keep people in. If we can get Vance's men into the courtyard and secure the gates from the outside, they become trapped in their own fortress." "And Vance himself?" "He will run. A man like Vance always keeps an escape route. If the courtyard is locked down, he will go for the lower exit, the tunnel to the cove, if it exists. That is where you come in." Edward studied her face. She had a plan, and from the way she was laying it out, she had been constructing it piece by piece since the moment she spotted the watchtower from the ridge. "The dummy ledger," Sarah continued. "Your men at the livery stable. Has anyone approached the carriage?" "I told the stable boy to send word if anyone came asking about my vehicle. He has not appeared, which means they have not searched it yet." "Then we let them find it. I will leave word at the warehouse through a channel that will reach Vance by this evening. A message suggesting that the Duke of Ashford is carrying the ledger in his carriage and plans to deliver it to the Whitehaven magistrate tomorrow morning. Vance will send his men to seize it tonight. And when they open it and discover the fake, they will take it back to Vance at the watchtower. He will examine it, realize the cipher is wrong, and understand he has been deceived. By that time, we will already be in position." "Where exactly will we be?" Sarah's eyes held steady on his.
"I will be at the courtyard gates. The structure is old. I studied medieval fortifications during my training with the Whitmore firm. Those gates will have a drop bar on the exterior side, a defensive feature designed to seal the courtyard during an attack. Once Vance's men are inside the walls, I can lock them in."
"And I will be at the tunnel exit."
"If it exists, and I am nearly certain it does. Every coastal watchtower of that period was built with a sally port or escape passage to the shore. Find it, block it, and Vance has nowhere left to go."
Edward finished his tea and set the cup down with a decisive clink. Tomorrow at dusk, then.
Tomorrow at dusk.
They spent the following day preparing. Edward hired a room at a quiet boarding house on the southern edge of Whitehaven, away from the harbour and the eyes of Vance's network. Sarah disappeared for several hours in the morning to plant the false information about the ledger through a chain of contacts she would not fully explain, and Edward decided that some details of her former profession were best left unexamined. By midday, word came back through the livery stable boy. 2 men had visited the stable that morning, asking casual questions about the Duke's carriage: who owned it, how long it had been there, whether the owner had been seen carrying luggage. The boy had answered truthfully, as instructed. The men had lingered near the carriage for several minutes before leaving. "They have marked it," Sarah said when Edward relayed the information. "Tonight they will come back for it. By tomorrow morning, the dummy ledger will be in Vance's hands, and he will know he has been tricked within the hour. Which gives us until dusk tomorrow to reach the watchtower and take our positions." They left Whitehaven separately in the late afternoon of the 5th day. Edward took the cliff road south on a hired horse, riding at an easy pace that would attract no attention from anyone watching the routes out of town. Sarah departed on foot an hour later, cutting inland through the farmland above the cliffs before descending toward the coast on a shepherd's track that brought her to the ridge overlooking the watchtower from the east. They met at a ruined sheepfold on the cliff top as the sun dropped toward the Irish Sea, turning the water to hammered copper. Below them, the watchtower stood on its rocky promontory like a clenched fist. The courtyard gates were open, and Edward could see 2 men standing near the entrance, one smoking a clay pipe and the other leaning against the wall with his cap pulled low over his eyes. "The tide is going out," Sarah said, studying the cove below the tower. "If there is a tunnel exit on the beach, it will be accessible within the hour. The entrance will be somewhere in the rock face below the tower foundation, probably concealed behind loose stones or driftwood." Edward nodded. "I will work my way down to the cove from the southern end of the beach. The rocks there will give me cover, and the sound of the waves should mask any noise." Sarah checked the position of the sun. Perhaps 40 minutes of useful light remained. "Give me until full dark to reach the gates. I need the shadows, and I need the men in the courtyard to have settled into their evening routine. Men who feel safe grow careless, and carelessness is the widest door there is." They parted without ceremony. Edward mounted his horse and rode a quarter-mile south along the cliff edge until he found a steep but passable track leading down to the shingle beach. He tethered the horse to a fence post and descended on foot, picking his way over loose rock and tufts of coarse grass until his boots crunched on wet stones at the waterline. The cove was small and crescent-shaped, bounded on both sides by dark outcrops of slate that jutted into the sea like broken teeth. The watchtower loomed above on the cliff, its upper windows catching the last orange light of the sunset. From down here, the base of the tower merged with the natural rock face in a wall of dark stone that had been standing since the time of the Plantagenets. Edward moved along the base of the cliff, running his hands over the rock where the tower's foundation met the natural stone. The surface was rough and wet with spray, covered in patches of barnacles and dark seaweed. He worked methodically, section by section, pressing and testing every irregularity. He almost missed it. A vertical crack in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways, hidden behind a large boulder that had fallen from the cliff face at some point in the distant past. The crack opened into a low passage that smelled of damp earth and old mortar. Edward could feel a faint draft coming from inside, which meant it connected to a larger space beyond. He wedged himself through the opening and followed the passage inward. The floor was uneven stone, worn smooth by centuries of occasional use. After 30 yards, the passage widened into a proper tunnel with a vaulted ceiling, and Edward could see the faint grey rectangle of a doorway ahead. This was the sally port, the escape route built into the tower's original design, intended to allow the garrison to slip away to the sea if the main entrance fell to an enemy. Edward found what he needed stacked against the tunnel wall. Lengths of old timber, remnants of scaffolding, or shoring from some long-forgotten repair,
heavy enough to serve his purpose. He dragged 3 of the largest pieces across the tunnel mouth and braced them against the walls, creating a barrier that would hold against a man's weight long enough to matter. Then he positioned himself in the shadows beside the blocked passage and waited. The darkness thickened around him. The sound of the waves faded to a rhythmic murmur at his back. From somewhere above, through the stone ceiling, he could hear the muffled sounds of voices and footsteps, Vance's men moving inside the tower. Then the courtyard erupted. The heavy clang of iron striking iron rang through the stone like a cathedral bell. The gates. Sarah had dropped the bar. Edward heard shouting, confused and angry, followed by the sound of fists hammering against metal.
Vance's men were locked inside their own courtyard, sealed behind gates that had been designed 600 years ago to withstand a siege. More shouting from above, closer now. Rapid footsteps on stone stairs descending. Someone had realized the tunnel existed, and they were coming down. Edward pressed his back against the cold wall and steadied his breathing. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the flickering glow of a lantern bouncing off the tunnel walls. 2 figures appeared at the far end of the passage, and behind them, moving with the coiled urgency of a man whose last option was disappearing, came a third. Vance. Edward recognized the sharp, angular face from the description Sarah had given him. Tall, thin, with deep-set eyes and a narrow jaw that gave him the look of a man perpetually calculating his next advantage. Vance reached the barricade and stopped. He held his lantern up, illuminating the wall of timber blocking his escape. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, and Edward watched the realization settle across his features like a curtain falling.
"Good evening," Edward said from the shadows. "I believe you have something that belongs to my household." Vance turned toward the voice with the sharpness of a cornered animal. His 2 companions stumbled backward, colliding with each other in the narrow tunnel. The lantern swung wildly, throwing jagged shadows across the vaulted ceiling. "You would be the Duke of Ashford," Vance said. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as though being trapped in a medieval tunnel by a man he had never met was merely an inconvenience in an otherwise productive evening.
"And you would be Roland Vance, escaped convict, master counterfeiter, and the man who sent armed intruders into my home to terrorize a member of my staff." Vance's eyes narrowed. "She is rather more than a member of your staff, Your Grace. Did she tell you what she really is? Did she tell you what she stole from me?" "She told me everything, including the location of £90,000 in forged banknotes that you manufactured before your arrest and have been desperate to recover ever since." The composure on Vance's face cracked for the first time. A muscle in his jaw twitched, and his grip on the lantern tightened until his knuckles went white. Behind him, his 2 men exchanged a glance that said very clearly they had not signed up for whatever this was becoming. "That ledger is my property," Vance said, his voice dropping to something low and hard. "Every entry in it represents years of my work. You have no idea what it cost me to build what I built." "I know exactly what it cost. It cost honest banks their reserves. It cost merchants their livelihoods. And it very nearly cost an innocent woman her life when your men broke into my estate and bound her to a chair." From somewhere above, the sounds of shouting in the courtyard had given way to a resigned silence. Vance's associates had stopped hammering on the gates. Without tools or leverage, 600 years of ironwork was not going to yield to bare fists and frustration. Vance glanced over his shoulder at the blocked tunnel mouth, then back at Edward. His mind was working, calculating exits and angles and possibilities, the way it must have worked every day of his criminal career. Edward could almost see the arithmetic happening behind those deep-set eyes. "There is still a negotiation to be had here," Vance said carefully. "The ledger contains names that would embarrass some very powerful families, men with titles, men with seats in high places. If that information were to reach the courts, the consequences would extend far beyond my modest operation. I suspect those families would pay a great deal to keep their names out of the public record." "I am sure they would."
And I am sure that is precisely the kind of arrangement you had in mind when you broke out of Pentonville. Recover the ledger, collect the forged notes, and use the names as insurance against anyone who tried to put you back behind bars." Vance said nothing. His silence was confirmation enough.
"The difficulty with your plan,"
Edward continued, stepping forward into the lantern light,
"is that the ledger is no longer yours to bargain with. It is in my possession, and it will be delivered to the proper authorities along with a full account of your activities, your associates, and the locations of your hidden currency. Every name in that book will be investigated, and every forged note will be seized and destroyed."
The tunnel fell quiet. Water dripped from the ceiling somewhere in the darkness behind Edward. The distant rhythm of the sea filled the silence between them like a slow pulse. Vance made his decision. He dropped the lantern and lunged forward, shoving past his two companions and throwing his shoulder against the timber barricade. The wood groaned but held. He struck it again, harder, and one of the bracing pieces shifted an inch against the tunnel wall. Edward grabbed the nearest timber and drove it back into position, planting his boot against the base.
Sarah's voice echoed down the tunnel from above.
"The magistrate's guards are here, 6 men on horseback. They are entering the courtyard now."
The fight went out of Vance like air from a punctured bellows. His shoulders dropped, his hands fell to his sides. His two companions had already pressed themselves against the tunnel wall with their palms raised, eager to demonstrate their complete cooperation with whoever was about to come down those stairs. Vance looked at Edward with an expression that was difficult to read. There was anger in it, certainly, and bitterness, and the exhausted resignation of a man who had spent weeks running, only to end up in a place worse than where he started. But beneath all of that, buried deep where a lesser observer might have missed it, there was something close to respect. "She trained you well," Vance said quietly. "She did nothing of the sort. I simply pay attention to the people in my household. You might try it sometime, should you ever have a household again." The magistrate's guards descended the tunnel with lanterns and iron shackles. Vance and his 2 men were led out through the courtyard, where the remaining associates sat in a defeated row against the wall with their hands bound and their heads down. Sarah stood near the gates with her arms folded, watching the procession with the composed expression of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for this particular evening. 2 days later, Edward and Sarah arrived at his city residence in Lancaster. It was a tall, elegant townhouse on a tree-lined square, with polished brass fittings on the door, and a butler who managed to conceal his surprise at seeing his employer arrive unannounced for the 2nd time in a week. The morning papers carried a brief notice about the arrest of an escaped convict in the Whitehaven area, along with the recovery of a significant quantity of counterfeit currency. The report credited the local magistrate's office and made no mention of a duke or a housemaid. Edward preferred it that way. They sat in the drawing room after breakfast, the morning light falling across the Persian carpet in long golden rectangles. A tea service sat between them on the low table, and the fire crackled softly in the grate. For the first time in 5 days, there was nowhere to ride, no one to follow, and no barricade to build. "I have been considering your position within my household," Edward said, setting down his cup. Sarah's expression remained neutral, though her hands stilled in her lap. "I understand if you wish me to leave your service, Your Grace. I entered your employment under false pretenses, and I placed your estate and your safety at risk. A letter of notice would be entirely reasonable." "A letter of notice would be entirely wasteful. I have just spent 5 days watching you decode encrypted documents, track armed criminals across 2 counties, and lock 6 men inside a medieval fortress using nothing more than your knowledge of old architecture. Sending you back to polish silver would be the single greatest misallocation of talent in the history of English domestic service." Sarah blinked. It was the first time Edward had seen her caught genuinely off guard. "I am appointing you Chief Estate Manager," he said. "You will oversee security and operations across all 4 of my properties. You will have a staff budget, a travel allowance, and quarters in whichever residence you are currently managing. Your salary will reflect the actual scope of your abilities, rather than the fiction under which you were previously employed." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped.
A carriage rattled past on the square outside. The butler's footsteps retreated down the hall with the practiced silence of a man who knew when to be elsewhere.
"You are offering me command of your entire estate operation," Sarah said.
"I am offering you the position you have effectively been performing for the past 5 days, with the addition of a proper title and a salary that does not insult either of us." The corner of Sarah's mouth lifted. It was small, barely there, the kind of expression that most people would have missed entirely. Edward did not miss it.
"Then I accept, Your Grace." Edward raised his teacup.
"Welcome to your new post, Miss Ashworth. I trust you will find it considerably more interesting than the linen cupboard." Sarah raised hers in return.
"I found a hidden vault behind your wine cellar and a cipher key inside your mantel clock. Your linen cupboard was never dull." They drank their tea in the quiet morning light, and the city carried on outside the windows, utterly unaware that the woman sitting in the Duke of Ashford's drawing room had just become the most formidable estate manager in the north of England.